Frédéric Chopin wrote almost exclusively for one instrument. Not because he lacked the technique to write for orchestra, his two piano concertos prove otherwise, but because he believed the piano was sufficient, that within its 88 keys was a universe large enough to contain everything he needed to say. He spent his life proving it. He took an instrument that, at its mechanical core, produces sound by hitting strings with hammers, and made it weep, rage, whisper, and pray. He did this through a combination of harmonic invention that anticipated music not written until decades after his death, and a sensitivity to touch and tone that remains the standard against which pianists are still measured. He died at 39. He was probably sick for most of his adult life. He gave fewer than 30 public concerts in his entire career, finding large audiences physically distressing. He lived in Paris for most of his adult life and never returned to Poland, which had been erased from the map of Europe by the time he was born and which he carried in his music with a specificity and a grief that made him the most intensely national composer in the history of Western art. Poland before Paris. Frédéric François Chopin was born on March 1, 1810, or possibly February 22, the records disagree, in the village of Zelazowa Wala near Warsaw. His father Nicholas was a Frenchman who had settled in Poland and taught French to aristocratic families. His mother Justyna Krzyżanowska was a Polish noblewoman of modest means who played the piano and sang. The household was musical without being professional, and the child who grew up in it was musical in a way that neither parent fully understood. He cried when he heard sad music. He ran to the keyboard in the middle of the night when a melody came to him. His first teacher, the Czech violinist Wojciech Zywny, taught him Bach and Mozart and recognized early that the boy's technique was developing faster than any teaching could account for. When Frédéric was 11, Zywny told the family honestly that he had nothing more to teach him. The next teacher was Joseph Elsner, director of the Warsaw Conservatory, who did something rare for a pedagogue of the era. He recognized that Chopin's harmonic language was already too original to be corrected, and chose to teach him theory and structure while leaving his voice alone. In his final report on Chopin, Elsner wrote 3 words next to his student's name: musical genius. The summers Chopin spent in the Polish countryside, at the estates of aristocratic friends in Mazovia, at the village of Safarnia, gave him something that formal training could not: immersion in Polish folk music. The mazurkas, obereks, and polonaises he heard were not collected as ethnographic material. They were absorbed into his nervous system and transformed into something that bore their rhythmic and modal character without reproducing their simplicity. The distinctive raised fourth of the Lydian mode, the asymmetrical accents of the mazurka rhythm, the ceremonial weight of the polonaise. These elements appear throughout Chopin's music not as quotations but as the grammar of a personal language that happened to be inseparable from a national one. The November Uprising and the Revolutionary Étude. In November 1830, Chopin left Warsaw on the concert tour that was supposed to establish his European reputation. Friends gave him a silver cup filled with Polish earth as a parting gift. He was 20 years old. He did not know he was leaving forever. Within days of his departure, Warsaw erupted in the November Uprising, a rebellion against Russian imperial rule that had been building for years. Chopin tried to go back. Friends and family convinced him that his health was too fragile for combat, that he could serve Poland better through his music, that he should continue west. He went to Vienna, then Stuttgart. In September 1831, in Stuttgart, he received news that the uprising had been crushed and Warsaw had fallen. He had been writing in his journal throughout the journey. What he wrote after Stuttgart is almost incoherent with grief and fury. The Étude in C minor, Op. 10 No. 12, what has always been called the Revolutionary Étude, emerged from this period. Whether it was literally composed in response to the fall of Warsaw or written earlier and experienced afterward as prophetic is disputed. What is not disputed is that the piece contains something that does not appear in Chopin's earlier work. A violence, a desperation, a quality of storm that is not beautiful in the way that beauty is usually meant. The left hand drives forward in a continuous torrent of 16th notes that never relents, the right hand strikes out above it in phrases that sound less like melody than like cries. It is one of the most overtly emotional pieces of music Chopin ever wrote, which makes it unusual, because Chopin's general approach to grief was not to shout it but to hold it very still and let it radiate. Paris, salons instead of concert halls. Chopin arrived in Paris in the autumn of 1831 and, with the exception of the final British tour, never left. The city suited him in ways that Warsaw could not have. It had the aristocratic salons he needed, the intimate spaces where music could be heard properly rather than projected into a vast hall against the competing noise of an audience, and it had a concentration of artistic talent that made his own talent legible in context. He met Liszt, who recognized him immediately as a peer and said so publicly. He met Berlioz, with whom he had little in common but a mutual admiration. He met the poet Heinrich Heine, whose German romanticism resonated with his own sensibility. Robert Schumann reviewed his variations on a theme from Don Giovanni and wrote, "Hats off, gentlemen, a genius." A sentence that circulated through European musical culture and announced Chopin's arrival more effectively than any concert could have. What he did not do was perform in public with any frequency. Franz Liszt thrived in large halls, developing the solo recital as a theatrical event. The pianist alone on stage, commanding thousands. Chopin found this concept close to unbearable. He wrote to Liszt that the crowd's breathing suffocated him, that curious gazes paralyzed him, that he went mute before unfamiliar faces. He gave perhaps 30 public concerts in his life. Instead, he performed in the aristocratic salons of Paris, the Rothschilds, the Czartoryski family, the Potocka household. In candlelit rooms of 20 or 40 people, where the nuances he was capable of could actually be heard. His income came primarily from teaching. He charged high rates for lessons, taught the children of the Parisian elite, and maintained a standard of living that included fine clothes and a private carriage. His students remembered him as brilliant, demanding, and occasionally terrifying when they played something insensitively. George Sand, a love that made and unmade him. In 1836, Chopin met Aurora Dupin, the novelist who published under the name George Sand. His first reaction, reported by several witnesses, was something close to disgust. She was unconventional in ways that offended his refined sensibilities, wearing men's clothes, smoking cigars, arguing with everyone, conducting her romantic life with a freedom that scandalized even Paris. "What an unsympathetic woman," he reportedly said. "Is she really a woman?" Within 2 years they were inseparable. The relationship lasted almost a decade and produced, on Chopin's side, the largest and most consistently brilliant body of work of his career. Sand organized their life around his needs, his fragile health, his irregular working hours, his need for silence and for the specific quality of attention that composition required. At her country estate at Nohant in central France, where they spent most summers from 1839 onward, Chopin worked in conditions as close to ideal as his constitution could provide, and the music that emerged from those summers is among the greatest piano music ever written: the third and fourth ballades, the barcarolle, the F minor fantasy, the Polonaise fantasy, dozens of mazurkas and nocturnes that compress entire emotional worlds into a few pages of notation. Majorca. The winter that should have killed him. In the winter of 1838 to 1839, Sand decided that Chopin's lungs needed the warm Mediterranean air of Majorca. They traveled to the island with her 2 children in November 1838, expecting sunshine and recovery. What they found was the worst winter in the island's recent memory: sustained rain, cold that the local buildings were entirely unequipped to handle, and a population that reacted to Chopin's cough, which was severe, and which they recognized as the sound of tuberculosis, with a hostility that was partly fear and partly the social stigma that the disease carried in an era when it was understood to be both contagious and fatal. Landlords evicted them. The possessions they had brought were burned by local authorities as a sanitary precaution. They were eventually housed in a former Carthusian monastery at Valdemasa, which was cold, damp, and largely unfurnished. The piano Chopin had ordered from Paris, a Pleyel, was held up in customs for weeks while he composed on a rented local instrument of such poor quality that he described playing it as torture. What he wrote in the monastery, despite the cough, the cold, the inadequate instrument, and the isolation from everything familiar, was the set of 24 preludes, Op. 28, one of the most concentrated and structurally perfect works in the piano repertoire. Each prelude is a complete world in miniature. Some last less than a minute, some stretch to 4 or 5, and together they cover every key and every emotional register, from the serenity of the A major to the funeral march of the A minor to the cascading raindrops, or perhaps something darker, of the D-flat major, known as the Raindrop Prelude. He also worked on the second ballade and several other pieces. The Majorca winter nearly killed him. It also produced masterpieces. Sand wrote about the experience afterward in her memoir Unhiver a Majorca, A Winter in Majorca, which made the island briefly famous and which Majorcans resented for decades for its unflattering portrayal of the local population. The monastery at Valdemasa is now a museum. The room where Chopin worked is preserved. Visitors can see the Pleyel piano that eventually arrived and the manuscript pages of the preludes. The invention of new forms. What Chopin did to musical form is easier to describe in terms of what he started with and what he left. He took the étude, a technical exercise designed to develop specific aspects of finger technique, and turned it into a concert piece of complete artistic seriousness, in which the technical challenge and the expressive content were inseparable. The études Op. 10 and Op. 25 are still played today, both for their difficulty and for their beauty, neither of which can be extracted from the other. He took the nocturne, a form the Irish composer John Field had established as an elegant, slightly sentimental salon genre, and expanded it into something that could contain grief, erotic longing, philosophical meditation, and narrative drama within a form that still sounded, on the surface, like a singing melody over a murmuring accompaniment. The nocturnes Op. 9, Op. 15, Op. 27, and the late nocturnes of the 1840s are among the most psychologically complex short pieces in the repertoire. They are what the form becomes when a genius takes it seriously. The ballades were his most radical formal invention. There was no instrumental genre called a ballade before Chopin. He created 4 of them, in G minor, A major, A-flat major, and F minor. Each structured as a kind of wordless narrative that builds to a catastrophic finale, and each suggesting, without ever specifying, the presence of a story behind the notes. Schumann believed the ballades were inspired by the poetry of Adam Mickiewicz, the great Polish romantic poet. Chopin neither confirmed nor denied this. What he produced was a new way of organizing musical time. Not around dance rhythms or abstract formal patterns, but around the logic of storytelling, with a beginning, a middle, and a devastating end. His harmonic language was, by the standards of his time, extreme. He used chromaticism and unexpected modulations with a freedom that suggested tonal centers were not destinations but mooring points, places the music touched briefly before drifting away. Debussy, who credited Chopin as the primary influence on his own harmonic thinking, said that Chopin had shown him that chords could function as colors rather than as logical propositions. This observation connects Chopin directly to Impressionism, which he did not live to hear and which could not have existed without him. The tempo rubato he practiced and taught, the slight flexible acceleration and deceleration of the melodic line over a strictly maintained harmonic pulse, was described by his students as something that could not be learned from notation, only from hearing him play. The left hand, he insisted, must be like a conductor, metronomically steady, providing the framework within which the right hand was free to breathe, to hesitate, to rush forward. Written music cannot capture this. It survives in the tradition of pianists who learned it from pianists who heard him, and in the recordings of Cordet and Rubinstein and later musicians who worked backward from their accounts. The end, a heart carried home. The break with George Sand came in 1847, entangled in family conflicts involving her son Maurice and the marriage of her daughter Solange. The specific circumstances were complicated and are still disputed by their respective biographers. What is clear is that the relationship ended badly, that Chopin felt the loss as something close to devastating, and that the last 2 years of his life, measured in musical output, are nearly empty. He who had written constantly for 15 years produced almost nothing after the separation. In 1848, he accepted an invitation from his Scottish student Jane Stirling to tour England and Scotland. The tour was financially necessary. His teaching income had collapsed during the revolutionary upheaval of that year, and physically catastrophic. The British climate, the social obligations, the cold carriages, the constant performances for audiences he found exhausting, all of it drained him at a rate his body could no longer sustain. He wrote from London that he was barely alive, that he was playing for 6 people and pretending it was a concert, that he could not compose anything because he had lost the ability to find musical ideas. He returned to Paris in November 1848 and spent the last year of his life unable to walk without assistance, giving occasional lessons to maintain some income, and receiving visits from friends who understood that they were saying goodbye. He died on October 17, 1849, at his apartment on the Place Vendôme, with his sister Ludwika at his bedside. He was 39 years old. His funeral at the Madeleine was attended by 3,000 people. The Mozart Requiem was performed, as he had requested. He was buried at the Père-Lachaise cemetery in Paris, where his grave remains one of the most visited in the world. But his heart did not go to Père-Lachaise. Before the burial, at Chopin's explicit instruction, his heart was removed from his body and given to his sister Ludwika. She carried it to Warsaw concealed in her luggage, hidden from Russian customs officials who might have confiscated it as a Polish nationalist relic. It was placed in an urn and sealed into the pillar of the Church of the Holy Cross in Warsaw, beneath an inscription from the Gospel of Matthew, "For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." The heart remained there through the Second World War, through the Nazi occupation, through the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, when it was removed temporarily for safekeeping and then returned. It is still there. The man who left Poland at 20 and never came back left his heart behind, literally, and it never left. Every few years, a small group of researchers petitions for permission to test the urn's contents. To confirm the heart is there, to test for the genetic markers of cystic fibrosis, which some musicologists believe explains the nature of his illness better than tuberculosis. Permission has always been refused. The heart belongs to the Church. The Church considers the matter closed.